Let's say your community is only 5 people. That's 5 people that are relying on you to lead them through your podcast or through your message. And we all focus on these big numbers. We all feel like we need to be big. But the truth is, if we have influence over one person, we are changing their lives. And that is truly a gift.
Most hosts never achieve the results they hoped for. They're falling short on listenership and monetization, meaning their message isn't being heard and their show ends up costing them money. This podcast was created to help you grow your listenership and make money while you're at it. Get ready to take notes. Here's your host, Adam Adams.
What's up, my friends? I am recording this quick disclaimer, not in my studio, and it's around the holidays. The kids are playing in the background. They're out of school. And I wanted to just let you know that episodes 132, 134, 136, 138, 140, and 142 are all going to be interview episodes. Instead of recording solo episodes around the holidays, I'm going to go ahead and keep giving you 4 episodes a week for now. But I'm going to have some of the previous recorded episodes that have never aired quite yet play through for episodes 132 to 142. So anyway, I hope you're having a great holiday if you're listening to this around the holidays. And I would say spend some time with your family. But if you ever are going to do something like what I'm doing now, just let your audience know. Just let your listener know. Now let's jump into an interview episode. Thanks.
Welcome back to the podcast on podcasting. It's your host, Adam A. Adams. And I'm excited to discuss a topic that we don't always discuss. And it's mostly focusing on what B. Evans looks at as something that can hold us back from not being able to achieve things in life. And I really want to put it into what holds us back from achieving things with our podcast. For example, I can't monetize. I don't have the listenership. There's a lot of those things that we say that B. Evans and her podcast, which we'll talk about your podcast here in a second about tearing out the tags, tear out the tags. Tags meaning, well, B, I'm going to let you explain what you mean by tags, why you named your podcast that, and let's add some value to a new podcaster.
That sounds great. Yeah. So my podcast was named after the itchy, scratchy label that lives inside of the shirt that you're wearing. And men have this too. I don't know if your suits have things like this, but for women, it's like always the fancy dress that you put on that has the super itchy, scratchy tag in it. And oftentimes that tag comes with a lot of information, right? A tag is simply an identifier. What I realized was we're going through life and we are in a swirling tornado of labels constantly, and our brains have a need to categorize things. So automatically, as you move through your day, your brain is putting things into those categories and labeling things. And people are doing the same thing of you. So we're kind of in this crazy interaction, this social interaction where there are positive and negative labels swirling around, and we have the choice of what we're going to pick up. And then I picture it like we're sort of sewing it into the interior of our being and attaching those tags to ourselves. And for me, I was moving through life and I'm a super curious person. And so I would find myself in many different scenarios and different social circles. And the tags that came with those brands or those social circles were always, they didn't go together necessarily. And so I would attach labels that had nothing to do with really who I was in my authentic self. And so my entire mission is getting people to realize that we almost get in a habit of using templated words in our lives. So you'll probably hear a podcaster say, I just want to be better, right? I want to be a better podcaster. Well, what is better? How do you define the word better? And what does it really mean to get to that point of being better? Because for you, it's going to be different than it is for me. So when we can really discover the words that we use to describe ourselves and then dig into the definitions behind those words, we get to really get to know ourselves on a level that's unique and different, and we become less affected by the way the world might be labeling us.
I was letting that resonate in, and very, very, very good stuff. And I think you're completely right. You mentioned one or two examples of things that many of us tell ourselves. Is there a few examples that you've seen with brand new podcasters or aspiring podcasters, not necessarily the person who says, I wish I was a better podcaster, but somebody who's trying to get into it or wanting to get into it, but maybe their self-talk, the language that they use holds them back from being able to either do it or do well at it?
Yes. So I have found that people who have the desire to start something, particularly a podcast or content creation, they're either recognizing a need, so a gap in an industry or an idea or a realm that needs to be filled. So they have a creative thought and they're like, gosh, people need to learn X about Y. Or they have a judgment of someone who is doing that thing, who is maybe not doing it well, or maybe doing it in unethical or inauthentic way. So they will think to themselves, I can do this, and I can do this in a way that will really serve the people searching for this information better. So what I have found about people who really want to do that thing is they've really recognized that there is an opening or a space that needs to be filled, but they don't always believe that they're the person that's going to be able to go into that space and really just fill that space, if that makes sense.
Well, all right. So I think I heard you say that there's two types of people that want to start a podcast. A, they simply recognize a niche that's not being fulfilled. Or B, they see people in a niche, but they may not feel like that person is being authentic or has the best of intentions. And so they feel like someone's got to push that person out so that the perfect listener can actually get that value without maybe getting taken advantage of.
Yes, that's my belief system.
So if these are the two reasons why people want to start a podcast, what holds us back from actually doing the podcast? I think I heard that sometimes we see the need or we see the wrong person, but we don't know if we're the right person. So what self-talk are we using that's really holding us back there?
I think that the first thing that pops up for most people is simply the unknowing on the how. So they're like, I don't know how to start a podcast. What kind of services do I need to look into? Are there people I need to hire that will train me or teach me classes? And usually those obstacles are a little bit easier to climb over because there are resources like this wonderful podcast. And then once they get past sort of the knowledge point and they start to understand what it's going to take, I find that that's when the inner self-talk starts to be an interrupter. So that's when you will start to face things like imposter syndrome and fear of failure, fear of success, and many things depending on who the new podcaster is. So when it's your inner bully, right? We are the ones who have chosen to pick up the labels that we've picked up and attach them to ourselves. Now, if you were raised to have a really good set of care instructions for yourself, you might have a tendency to pick up really positive labels and automatically believe that, hey, I can do this. Like I can do anything I want to do. However, if you grew up with someone who was constantly negative or constantly putting you down, or maybe making you always feel like you needed to be humble and lower yourself down to lift others up, then you might have a tendency to attach tags that will be those blockers. So you'll go to start that podcast and all of a sudden your imposter syndrome is pinging because you're going, well, what makes me the expert? Why would anyone listen to me? I'm just a stupid girl that lives in Colorado. And it doesn't have to be logical. It can be very mean things that we say to ourselves. And when you're having a conversation with yourself, nobody really gets to criticize like how mean the things are that come up. And those thoughts can be like a hamster wheel in our brain that just play on repeat. So every time we go to make a podcast episode, say we're making a weekly episode, those same thoughts run through our heads, and that really shows up and limits us from making the content we really want to make.
You brought up 3 things that were interesting, 3 things that can hold us back. The imposter syndrome, which I feel all the time. Maybe you could help me overcome it on this call, because you mentioned even sometimes when we have a podcast that goes out like weekly, or in my case, it's 4 or 5 times a week, that each time we stand behind the mic, we feel a little bit of that imposter syndrome. And I'll be honest and open that on this episode, on the one that I just did an hour ago, on the one that I did earlier today, each and every episode, I always think I'm just this guy from Colorado. My podcast isn't that old, and it becomes a challenge sometimes to record the episode. So I'd love to find a way to dive a little bit more into that. The second one that you said was fear of failure. I think this is one of the biggest ones ever. I think it's larger than imposter syndrome, personally. And as far as actually holding somebody back, because some people are like, I'll just get over the imposter syndrome. Many people are like, I get it, I feel that way, but fear of failure, if we believe that we're going to fail at our podcast, most of us wouldn't do it at all, because it's embarrassing. We know that it wastes a lot of time, maybe even money and effort and attention, if we go into something and can't follow through with it. I know for myself, I was watering plants. I grew up on a tree farm. We had a little farm. We had corn.
Cool.
We had a bunch of plants and trees, deciduous and pine trees and everything in between. We sold Christmas trees, and I was making $1 an hour, which as a 5-year-old, 6-year-old, 7 and 8-year-old, until I got my $2 an hour raise, I was making $1 an hour. And in my first season, it was July, and probably well over 100 degrees. And I came home a lot faster than normal. I came home from the farm. We lived basically on the farm. I went to the house, and my stepdad said, like, how did you finish so fast? Because there's a lot of effing trees. Like, there's no way you could be done. And I just said, Dad, it's really hot. I don't need to make the full amount of money. He reamed me. He says, Adam, if you start a job, you have to finish it. And that holds me back sometimes when I want to start a new thing, because I know that deep down, if I don't follow through, if I don't do this for 3 years, if I fail, then I'm going to be embarrassed. And maybe like my dad will yell at me for, why did you even start that thing, like, and fail at it? So it's hard. The third one you mentioned, however, is one that I've never heard before. Fear of success.
Mm-hmm.
And I was like listening to you, and I fought that when you brought up fear of success. I said to myself, nobody's afraid to succeed. Like, you want to succeed. That's the whole goal of the podcast. Why wouldn't you? If you're going to have a podcast, you're not doing it to fail. So obviously there cannot be anything called fear of success. But then when you mentioned, as we're brought up with our tags, with our labels, many of us are told that humility is important, that humility shows that we're good people.
Mm-hmm.
And if our podcast gets out in front of too many people, if we have too many followers, if we become famous, if we make a ton of money, all of a sudden we become that rich person that we always despised or thought was evil. Or all of a sudden we have a big name for ourselves And then it hurts us inside if we have the wrong tags because we were told that we have to stay humble and not flaunt ourselves, etc. Before I ask any questions on any of these three things, I feel like you have two things in your head that you'd probably like to share. What are those two things that it looks like are on your mind?
Well, I wrote a lot of notes, and I think we're going to need to unpack each one of these individually. So do you want to dive into imposter syndrome first?
Hell yeah.
Okay. So here's the thing about imposter syndrome. There's an actual Webster's dictionary definition of every word. And if you switch over to the Oxford dictionaries, the definition is going to be slightly different. The meaning is the same. And generally, these educational resources that we have are going to be the actual definitions. But based on the way you and I were both raised, differently, might I add, you're going to have a different definition of imposter syndrome than I might. And so it starts with really, what is imposter syndrome? How do you define it?
I guess I feel like my imposter syndrome would be that I'm clearly not the best at everything that I present on, not the best at everything that I would discuss. And because someone has bigger muscles than me, I'm not the strongest. So why would I teach you how to lift weights? Or because somebody is faster on their mountain bike than me, even though I mountain bike several days a week. If I tried to start a podcast on mountain biking, somebody who's better than me, who clearly has more experience or could go downhill even faster, or is just way in better shape on going on the uphill, which is boring anyway. I don't want to be good at that. No, I do. I'm working toward it. Might judge me for trying to act as if I was like this expert in mountain biking. And the same thing when I did real estate. I still do real estate. I'll always be an investor. But when I had my podcast on real estate investing, when I launched it, I had been doing real estate on the side for 11 or 12 years on the side when I started it. And I remember thinking, there's so many guys out there that are way older than me, have more gray hair than me, who've lost more, who've made more, who've experienced more. Maybe I had only done less than a dozen real estate transactions over 12 years, which is great for most people. But I would think someone else in this field has done more than me. So why will people listen to me? And also, those people who have done more, are they going to roll their eyes at me and judge me and demean me and condemn what I'm trying to do because they're like, dude, he hasn't raised as much private equity as I have for my deals, or he hasn't closed on as many large apartments as I have. His portfolio is only 5 million and mine is 400 million. And same thing with the podcast. On podcasting, there's a few people that podcast that clearly have done it longer. There's a few people in podcasting that have a stronger listenership. And I try to teach, how do you grow your listener base? I actually own a company called Grow Your Show, growyourshow.com. Grow Your Show's main purpose is to give people more listeners, ratings and reviews, more credibility, more traction with their podcast. And we do a great job compared to what they could do on their own. But I still secretly feel like, oh, but this one person who has more than I do is going to think I'm a fraud, for example. So all of that.
So there's so much to unpack with imposter syndrome. And just really quick, my definition of imposter syndrome is it shows up similarly in that I feel like I need to be the expert, right? Like I can't show up and talk about this because I don't know as much as someone who has studied this their whole life. And what I really had to realize is that I don't want to wear the tag expert. I am the learner who's stepping through it with people and I'm helping people, but I don't want to be the expert. I am a polymath. Expert is like the most boring word on the planet to me because it means I have to pick a really specific lane and like hone down and focus on it and become the expert. That I would be miserable in that life. I would be so bored. But it's interesting how when we face imposter syndrome, we're all sort of dealing with this issue of credibility. So I found this, and I'm going to use snowboarding as an example because you're a fellow Coloradan, so I feel like you'll relate. So there are so many people that are better snowboarders than I am. There are people who launch themselves out of half pipes and off of 25-foot gaps and double kink rails, and they're just doing all kinds of crazy cool things and posting videos on Instagram. Those people are so good and they're such masters of the sport, but are they good teachers? They might be. The answer could be yes. The other question I would ask is, do they want to spend the time teaching others, teaching beginners how to snowboard? So when we talk about imposter syndrome, and trust me, all the same ideas come up for me with regards to the work that I'm doing. There's always going to be someone out there that we believe is better than us, but that's also based on our measurement tools. So we're comparing ourselves to people that it's our own evaluation of our deficiencies versus what their talents and achievements are. Now, we could be wrong, right? That person could be looking at us thinking we are really amazing at what we're doing because maybe we're better teachers, even though they're actually better at, you referenced mountain biking. And so it's funny to me how so many of us and so many of the listeners that are here with us on the podcast today, we're allowing ourselves to be blocked because we don't feel like we have enough credibility. But what makes the world turn is conversation and connection. And so even if you're not the expert and you don't want to wear the expert tag, it doesn't mean that you can't show up and have curious conversations that propel people forward in the subject that you want to teach on. And I would say that that's the case with podcasting. I can learn a lot from walking through this with someone who's also a beginner because we're stumbling through the same things. Where someone who's an expert and who's mastered this, they're probably going to forget the dirty details and all of the struggle that you walk through in that first year where you're really building your community and listenership. And so for that, I would say you write imposter syndrome down on a sticky note, you sit with it and you think to yourself, what really is underneath the imposter syndrome? Because really, imposter syndrome is just a template. Oh, it's just a templated word we put on things because we don't know how to explain what's underneath it. So for me, it was the tag expert. Well, wait a second. I don't want to be an expert. So that's easy. You just tear that tag in half, remove it from the inside of you, and then you decide, what do I want to be? Well, I want to be a curious host. I want to ask curious questions. I want to honor my guests. I want to feature them and make them feel very complimented. I want to learn. I want to have connection, right? That's my number one is if I can connect with someone who will add value to my life, then it's going to add value to my listeners' lives as well, which makes it easier to tear out the tag imposter syndrome.
Yeah. Very, 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 very good. I wrote down, I don't want to wear the tag expert. And it was something that was intentional for you. And I think that I felt like in many cases of my whole life that if I'm going to speak on something, I need to be the expert on something.
Right.
And you've really opened up my mind to something new, a new way of thinking. And I enjoy the thought process of almost physically reaching in and grabbing that tag that I hate. It's been itching and bothering me, and just ripping it out to make room for other tags that I'd rather be. Like with you, I don't want to be the expert. I want to be the curious host. I want to learn and grow. and bring other people along for the ride. So do you want to dive into that second piece then, or is there more on imposter syndrome?
I do. So there's one last thing I want to share about what you said about the experts and the people who are better at the thing, sort of casting stones at you and criticizing you. And sometimes those can be judgments that we think others are having about us, but we're making an assumption, right? And sometimes not. Sometimes those people really are just slinging stones and like shooting rubber bands at us, and they're happy to criticize us. But as a podcaster and fellow podcasters listening, your audience is one community and your critics are another community. So when we allow our critics to tag us and make us feel less than and put imposter syndrome within us, we're wearing tags that aren't honoring the audience that's over in another community craving something from us because they've connected with us and they really are gaining value from being in our worlds and having us as a leader in their life. So if you think of the book Tribes by Seth Godin, when you're the leader of a tribe, your imposter syndrome cannot get in the way of what you have and the value you have to bring to that community of people. Who cares if another community of critics is slinging rocks at you if you're helping the people that are in your tribe? And I think sometimes we have a tendency to focus on the critics, and it can be a handful of people. Let's say your community is only 5 people. That's 5 people that are relying on you to lead them every day through your podcast or through your message. And we all focus on these big numbers. We all feel like we need to be big. But the truth is, if we have influence over one person, we are changing their lives. And that is truly a gift.
Yeah. Drop the mic right there. I liked how you mentioned that your audience is one community and the critics are another community. And I'm thinking, I'm not serving the critic anyway. Not that I even know that I have a critic, which is random. This is all like internal. Like no one's come out and said, I don't like what you're doing. No one's ever said, you're teaching that wrong. Like that's never once happened. So I could be completely creating this critic. But the point that I was going to make is the audience being one community, the critics a totally different community. We're not serving the critics anyway.
Right.
We're serving our audience. And I loved how you mentioned, even if it's just one person that we were adding value to and touching their life, that would be worth it. That would be a ripple that we were making in the water that could potentially grow that influence and the message that we intended on creating in the first place. You mentioned a book called Tribe by Seth Godin. I'm going to look it up and buy it so I can listen to it. Look it up and buy the audio book, by the way. Yeah. Dyslexia, I don't read.
That's all right.
With Seth Godin, his book, I'll also make sure that we put that into the resources of the podcast right here. So any listener can scroll down and be able to grab that book. And if I can do an affiliate link to make 5 cents off of it, I will do that as well, because we all have to monetize our podcasts in some way.
Absolutely.
So B, the second thing we talked about was fear of failure. And I know you made quite a bit of notes as I was sharing some stuff. What did you feel like we needed to address there?
All right. So this one for me is a heavy one. And I think most of us face fear of failure at some point in our lives. And really, anytime we step outside of our comfort zones, there's always that kind of proverbial cliff that we feel like we're going to either jump off of and fly and have like this beautiful parachute that opens, or we're going to sort of like crash and burn and not come out of it very, very pretty and with a lot of scars, right? So it's interesting when I think of my fear of failure, and it's still there. It's always there when we're really taking risks. And my content is really about taking risks. And so I'm sort of always turning and doing something crazy that makes me feel a little silly and makes me feel like I'm probably going to fail. So I just shared with you, I auditioned for the Denver Bronco cheerleaders this year. And there are hundreds of women that audition. And I made it through 3 rounds of tryouts to the top 60 finalists. And I didn't make the team. So in a lot of people's minds, I believe that they see that as failure. But I am 35 years old. I'm a mom of 2 and a stepmom of 4. I have several businesses. I'm a very busy person. And I have worked really hard over this last 2 years to be in really good shape in order to even attempt to do this thing. And that for me is hugely successful. Like top 60, I'm a badass, right? Sorry if you don't cuss on your show. I just did. But you can bleep me. But it's funny how when I started at the beginning of this journey, I had to define what failure was going to be. Because failure for me was 6 years of excuses of why I couldn't try out because I was getting older. And that tag, too old, that kept showing up and kept making me feel like I have too many wrinkles or I've gained a little bit of weight because I've had kids. Failure to me was coming out of an abusive relationship where I was taking things that I love, like dance, and honoring that person and the way that they tagged me and not chasing after my dreams because I didn't have the belief in myself that I once did when I was in my young 20s. So other people might think, oh, you didn't make the team. That's too bad. But failure to me was actually in not trying. It's so hard for us when we're starting something new because we don't really know what failure is, right? Do we really take the time to define, like, if nobody listens to my podcast, that's a complete failure, maybe. Or if I never make more than 10 episodes, that's a failure. If I never monetize my podcast, that's a failure. But then there are other people that will think, if I'm never featured on Oprah's top 10 influencers of the year, then I've failed. And so some of us have these really high expectations of ourselves that aren't realistic the first year you're starting. They might be in year 10 when you've gained a huge following and you want to elevate your goals. But some of us start out with these misinformed definition of what failure is. And so we're scared of a thing that we actually haven't discovered. We're scared of an unknown thing. Do you feel that way?
Yeah. I have to just say that your philosophy and outlook and the way that you read and interpret the world is eye-opening to me. So I appreciate just taking thoughts and concepts that I thought were simple or black and white or gray and being able to see them in Technicolor.
Yeah.
So,
oh, I love that. Thank you. That's a huge compliment. I appreciate that.
Really good stuff. I would be a lot more speechless if we weren't doing a podcast, and that would just be awkward, I think, for every listener to just sit there with just some crickets and twiddling our thumbs and all that kind of stuff. But yeah, I'm probably going to listen to this episode a few times and just think of the world the way that you look at the world, because it's super interesting. And definitely huge plug for your podcast, which is all about what we're talking about today. It's all about the labels that we give ourselves and how it's possible to rip them out. A lot of good stuff. Is there anything that you'd like to mention on fear of failure before we move to fear of success?
Yes. So the fear of failure, you mentioned 3 things: can't follow through, embarrassing, and cost. And I'm thinking monetary cost, but there are other costs. There's time costs, and there's got to be a couple of others. My brain's not going there. But here's the thing about, if we were to go and sign up for a college class, nobody would criticize us. They would applaud us. They would celebrate us for going to learn something new. And we would have we'd have to follow through in order to achieve there. We could be embarrassed if maybe we fail tests or maybe we don't succeed in that. And there's a cost. There's a time cost and there's a monetary cost. But for some reason, that's not as scary because it's so socially acceptable. You just go sign up for a college class. You don't even think twice about it. You don't consider that you're going to fail at it because you know that you've completed other classes in the past. So I think it's a slightly different animal when we're thinking about doing something we've never done, like start a podcast. Because the truth is, there's learning in all of that, all of those pieces. So if we're willing to go and pay for a college class, why would we not be willing to pay for an experiment to start a podcast that we're going to learn something from? Even if it ends up not being a podcast for the next 17 years, it's going to come with success and a life lesson for us that will maybe lead to something else, like writing a book or speaking on stage. And when we let a failure stop us, we can't even get to the point where we're fearful of succeeding, which is the next subject we're going to dive into. So that's my piece on that.
I've definitely felt with even a previous podcast that I started, I didn't want to just cancel the podcast because the story that I think I told myself, like what I heard me say, because I might have been actually suppressing or arguing against or ignoring what was probably deep down. The story that I told myself, and you are a mom and a stepmom, right? So I'm a dad and a stepdad myself.
Oh, nice.
The story that I had told myself is, this is kind of like one of my kids. I created them. I love them. I support them. They are great on their own. It would be horrible to kill the kid. It would be so bad if I have this podcast to just go and like let go of the podcast, because it's an organism on its own. It's like a living, breathing place that thousands of people come to every single week.
Right.
And it would be a shame, I said, to let it go. But I am hearing you talk about fear of failure, and I'm thinking that the real deep down reason that I was afraid of just cutting out the podcast was because I thought that people would look at me that I failed the podcast, that the podcast wasn't working. And so I quit it. And which wasn't the case, but I think I cared a lot about that people knew that I was successful with the podcast. And so I went the route of selling it to someone else. I told myself this other story. It's my kid. That's a beautiful story. But I think deep down, it was like, I don't want people to think that I was a shitty podcaster. So I'm going to sell it to prove to everybody that I know what I'm doing in this realm, this is fun. Thank you for being my psychologist for a little bit of time.
Well, remember, I'm not the expert. This is just my walk through life. And this is what I really believe is we can learn so much from each other by just having deep and meaningful conversations and digging into the definitions behind things. I want you to finish what you were saying, and then I kind of want to steer us into where we're going next, if you don't mind. Cool. This is the problem with having podcasters on your show. I'm like, I'm taking the host mic.
No, I've pretty much mentioned my thought there is, I believe after hearing what you're saying and rethinking it, I was probably identifying with a certain tag and telling myself a certain story to maintain a certain status in a way, when in actuality, if I just went with what I want and ignored the tags, then I probably would have been like, all right, F this, like, I'm done with this. That was great. That was fun. But I want to focus over here. And it would have been a little bit more simple, because it takes time to find a buyer, negotiate a buyer, and hand over a podcast when you're switching hosts. So
for sure,
there was a lot that went into keeping up appearances, I think, for me.
Yeah. So this is how we end up with tags. And I'm sure your stepdad is an amazing human being. And most of that generation, and I really believe we as parents just have things that we say. People are always surprised I tag my kids. I'm like, you can't help but tag your kids because you say stuff. And sometimes we say things that we heard our parents say, and sometimes we have our own little quirky things we say. But when you told me that he said, if you start a job, you have to finish it, that is just a normal thing that I think most of us have been told as kids, because you and I both know as a parent, there are times where your kids will go to get the eggs from the chicken coop and you're like, you want to pull your hair out because they dropped 6 of them on the way back over, or they were throwing them at each other or whatever. So you say these things you've heard because you're trying to get your kids to realize they need to be responsible. But we pick those up as implied tags as kids, and you're still wearing that tag today. So what your stepdad said to you, and I am sure he didn't mean for it to be a negative that you're carrying around, but we hear these things that we then attach as labels. I need to be responsible. I need to not be a quitter. I need to follow through. I need to be someone who never walks away from something that's making me unhappy. All of these things are sitting within us as these lessons learned. Well, the problem is they're all origin tags. So we collected all of them as kids. We didn't really know what we were picking up, and we didn't really have any control. And then we have all of these expectations, this checklist of sorts that wasn't even necessarily told to us. Sometimes we just believed certain things that our parents told us, or believed certain things about the community we grew up in. And so I think most of us get to a young 20s age, maybe even 18, that magical age where we have to start making adult decisions. And we go, okay, this is the person that I was supposed to become. And so this is the person that's now going to navigate the rest of my life. And we kind of lose the lesson that we're supposed to develop and change and grow. And so we feel like we're betraying our own selves, which, P.S., we didn't really create. Other people sort of created that self. And so we're betraying something that isn't who we really want to be, and that person that really honors where we're going. So a lot of us, your podcast and your situation where you had to find a buyer and feel like you didn't want to fail, it's no different than putting 8 years of education into an undergrad and a master's degree, and then ending up in an 18-year career where you're like, how do I leave this stable career where I'm providing for my family and I make this great money, but I hate my life and I'm doing something that doesn't honor who I am as a person, and it doesn't help people, and whatever those things are that we feel like we're violating. And so that is why tearing out the tags gets so uncomfortable, because for at least, and I would love for you to argue with me on this because there's no science behind this number, but I would say the first 20 to 30 years of your life, you're not really in control of the labels that are handed to you. And you're just sort of attaching them without acknowledging the weight that you're carrying. Does that make sense?
I'd have to think about that and process it, because in a way, you got to be right. When these labels are given to us by our mom, our dad, our teachers, society, our girlfriends, our boyfriends, whatever, over time. But I also believe that there's a lot about a human that in a way never changes and feels very natural and not nurture. For example, my sister and I are only 2 years apart. We grew up at the same time in the same household with the same parents. And we're like night and day. She's taken labels that I haven't taken. And I don't think it's just because we're male and female or 2 years apart. I think that there might be additional pieces of our maybe anatomy, the way that our brains function, the way that we view a world that gives us cognitive bias to strengthening those thoughts and tags over time that weren't necessarily given to us by our parents, but it's how we went through the world. I'm not sure. This is very just me trying to think. So,
No, I agree. And I think a lot of times our initial personality traits and part of our core wiring will causes us to pick up or not pick up on certain labels. Like I'm super extroverted, so I thrive on human connection. So I'm probably going to be more affected by strangers than someone who's introverted because they're not having that same interaction and not enjoying that same interaction that I am. So it's complicated. We as humans are complicated. We're complex creatures. And there's so much that we don't take the time to really dig in and have these conversations with ourselves, not to sound crazy. Hashtag crazy, that's a tag. But it is important for us to really understand the way that we define ourselves and the way that we categorize ourselves.
good stuff. Good stuff. Can we go into the fear of success?
Yeah, definitely.
I think that it was a huge aha moment for me. And I think for most listeners to even think that it's possible to be afraid of something like that. What are your thoughts, B?
So all I can speak to on this is my fear of success. And I think that it can show up for people in different ways depending on your own walk. So hopefully this will kind of inspire you to discover if you have a fear of success, because I don't think everybody does. I think fear of failure is more common. However, I really recognized through my life that my two core values were fighting each other. So one of my core values is discovery. I'm a very curious person. I love playing new sports and chase new vocational, crazy, like I want to start a balloon animal company or like just bizarre things that most people are like, why would you do that? That's bizarre. And yes, bizarre is probably a tag as well. And then my other core value is relationship. And I am just somebody who thrives on meeting new people and hearing strangers' stories and really getting to hear like the unique, extraordinary things that people that I don't know have done in their lives. And so what would happen in my life is I would be curious and I would go discover something new, and that would come with a group of new relationships. Well, then I would try to put those relationships together with relationships in another category of my life. And I would find that those people didn't get along or they didn't believe the same things. And so I would always kind of feel like I had to give up one in order to keep the other. And it just was conflict for me. So fear of success in any discovery that I went out and did meant the relationships in my life were going to come with a roller coaster of emotions. And so I think it was always scary for me to feel like I would threaten people if I changed, or I would make my family uncomfortable if something that I learned in my discovery process made me show up as a different person. And so for me, it was a lot about, if I become hugely successful in this, are the people that I love going to stand by me and be here cheering for me? Or are they going to then become my critics? Because I personally couldn't handle that. It doesn't sound logical, but we will actually hold ourselves back if we feel like the people that we love aren't going to come alongside of us and stay supporters of what we're doing.
So we are hitting that 1 o'clock mark, and I was just messaging my assistant to allow just a couple of minutes here. So why don't you take a sec to finish your thoughts on fear of actual success, and we'll call this episode out.
Yeah, definitely. I think the bottom line in what we've done today is we've shared 3 things that are just subjects in our life, things that we might be afraid of to start new podcasts or to write a book or to create content. And those came with a lot of tags that are stacked underneath these fears or that are stacked underneath this imposter syndrome. So it's just really important for us to really understand that there are deeper things happening underneath some of these templated words that we use, like fear and imposter syndrome. So I hope that today inspired your listeners to go into their creation of their new podcasts and start tearing out these tags that are holding them back, because the world needs to hear as many voices amplifying positivity and amazing knowledge building, valuable platforms.
Love it. Love it. Just to kind of wrap up some of what I learned today, and I wouldn't be able to hit it all because there's quite a bit of really insightful things that I got from this episode. You talking about cheer and growing up doing cheer, getting into like Phoenix Suns and cheering for them, and then leaving that for a few years while with the kids and the ex, I believe. And then after a few years deciding to get back into it and not making it, and that wasn't failure. When you discussed Webster Dictionary, and I'm trying to remember the other one, because there's so many, Oxford Dictionary, and then there's also like, if you go on Google, there's like these, I don't know if they're called New Age dictionaries, but it's like the slang for these days.
Like an urban dictionary.
Urban. Yeah, that's what I was looking for. So each of us has our definition of what success and failure is.
Yeah.
And internally, there's tags that we need to remove if we're going to be fully successful as well, including my fear of not following through, of quitting a podcast. My personal fear of that is irrational. It is attached to something that I need to find a way to get rid of.
Right.
My sweetheart did a fitness competition. So she's in her 50s and she wasn't sure if she was like in the most fit, whatever, but she did it just to challenge herself. And her success was the trying. And your success was getting into ridiculously great shape after a couple of kids and several years, and getting back on the field and pushing out hundreds of other women.
Yeah.
And being in top 60, that's badass. You crushed it.
Thank you.
And with our listener, as they may be starting a podcast, it's trying to identify and understand what tags do we have that we want and what tags do we have that hold us back, and will allow us to be able to push past some of these fears of failure, of success, or of imposter syndrome, maybe rocking the boat with other people. And I fully believe that anyone who listens to this episode, regardless of if they're going to podcast or if they already have one, will get a lot of value. So B. Evans, thank you for spending the time with us. To the listener, want to let you know, if you didn't already know this, the first 6 episodes of our podcast is a 101 course. It is a podcasting course from the beginning to the end. That's all you need. I don't need your email address, or you don't need to go to a website. I'm not going to pixel data and chase you around. It's none of that. It's free. It's easy. It's just episodes 1 through 6. If you've checked it out already, leave us an honest rating and review what you thought of it. If you haven't yet checked it out, go back through 1 through 6 before you listen to the next episode. Bye for now. This episode is brought to you by GrowYourShow.com. Grow Your Show lets you be the star of your show while we handle all the hard stuff. We offer reliable and affordable post-production services that allow you to grow your show organically without all the work. So go ahead and check out the website right now, and feel free to schedule a call with me, and let's take your show to the next level. Again, GrowYourShow.com. You just press record. We handle the rest.